Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. In just a few minutes, we're going to talk about America's spiritual founding father, one of the more famous people from colonial America, and learn some lessons about that. And then in the second hour, we're going to spend some time talking about becoming an agent of redemption. But before we get to all of those topics that we will be discussing with our various authors, I did want to mention that today, the Center for Medical Progress released its third video exposing Planned Parenthood's involvement in selling aborted baby parts. We've talked about this before, but this one perhaps the most graphic yet, and it is an illustration of why we've encouraged you to take some action. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I kind of like how Nate Jackson puts it. He said the Center for Medical Progress has a good strategy: capture and release undercover film of Planned Parenthood's depravity, wait for the inevitable craven defense and denial, then turn up the heat with subsequent video releases that show even more offensive material. If you thought the first two were a little bit graphic, this one really is. The third video release is very graphic. It depicts, as feared, the dissected parts of an aborted baby, so viewers beware, obviously. A technician working with an 11-week-old aborted baby talks and laughs about getting $200 to $300 per baby by charging more per organ or per specimen, and certainly that is the case. And so we now listen to and hear from Dr. Savita Gindi, Vice President Medical Director of Planned Parenthood of Rocky Mountain. Of course, we've heard from some of the other individuals, all of them fairly higher up, and it illustrates again why we've encouraged you to take some action. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, you'll see that we have, first of all, the video section, and we can post more of the videos, but we have, I think, at the moment, the first one, which is with Dr. Deborah Nucatola, but of course, we can put some of the others up there if you would want to see them. They're pretty easy to find out on the internet anyway. And then we have under our Take Action section, Defund Planned Parenthood. And if you have not done so, this latest video is even more reason for you to take some action. We have some of the information about the Center for Medical Progress. If you click on that button, then it gives you an opportunity to put in your name and address, and that will then surface your two senators and your representative, in case you don't know who they are. We have a suggested note that you can send to them. You can make your changes, you can add your signature, and then you can hit submit and let your elected representatives know what you think in light of some of these videos. So I did want to mention that today. We will certainly later in the broadcast in the next couple of days deal with this in more detail, but in case you have not seen the third one, first of all, viewer beware because of the graphic nature of it. But second of all, just one more reason for you to take action if you have not done so. We're going to talk today about George Whitefield, America's spiritual founding father. And the author of this is Dr. Thomas Kidd. He is professor of history at Baylor University, and he is a senior fellow at Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion. He has written quite a number of books, some of which we've talked about on this program. For example, we've talked with him about Patrick Henry, First Among Patriots, A God of Liberty, A Religious History of the American Revolution, and The Great Awakening, The Roots of Evangelical Christianity in Colonial America, as well as The Great Awakening, A Brief History of Documents, and he's written some others as well. This latest book is on George Whitefield. It is published by Yale University Press, and it is a book that will help us understand the
profound influence of that evangelist and the influence that he had not only in colonial America, but on the American Revolution, and really even in the way some people do open-air evangelism today. 300 years after this charismatic evangelist's birth, and we have now an opportunity to talk with Dr. Thomas Kidd. Thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
I am impressed that Yale University Press would publish this. Not that you have not had some other books published by very outstanding publishers, but this one is very religious, and you come as an evangelical Christian, and I think that's a very good reason why I think people would want to read the book.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think that there's sometimes more openness in the academy to Christian perspectives than you would think, especially if there's an issue of being able to reach an untapped market. And I think maybe Yale likes that idea. But I've had a great relationship with them, and they don't mind that I identify as an evangelical Christian. But I do have to write in the book with an understanding that some of my audience is going to be non-Christians. And so I can't just tell them, well, it's obvious, God did this, God did that, but I have to sort of persuade a little more and raise the idea that God is doing something profound in the history of the Great Awakening and in Whitefield's career.
And you say that you don't really come with historical axe to grind, but you do come with something that I think is significant, and that is you identify yourself, even in the book, as an evangelical Christian. And let's get the disclaimer out of the way. I believe that an atheist can look at John Wesley, George Whitefield, Patrick Henry, whoever you want to pick, and do a good historical job. Mm-hmm. That being said, I still think that you have a little bit of a one-upmanship in that you've been around evangelists, you've been around Baptists, you've been around Calvinists, you understand some of the lingo. There are probably, I just still have the feeling that there are some advantages you have in understanding some of the nuances that a person that does not have that religious background might not have.
That may be true. I think that there are advantages, for instance, when I'm reading his writings, whether it's his journals or his sermons, but he is so thoroughly conversant with the Bible, as you might expect, but he just speaks the Bible in everything that he writes, whether it's just talking about his travels across the Atlantic or obviously in his sermons, but he often doesn't cite chapter and verse. And so sometimes I'm able, I think, to pick out, oh, right, that's from Jeremiah or something like that, even though I'm sure I even miss some of the references as much as I try to read the Bible, But his language is just utterly formed by the King James Bible.
Yes.
And his theology is deep and profound. Some people have tried in the past to say that Whitefield, he was just a celebrity pastor and he was really kind of shallow. I don't think that's true at all. I think Whitefield was a very serious Christian thinker, and I'm maybe able to draw out some of that just an average reader wouldn't be able to recognize as readily.
And let me just time talking about him. Well, really in the years leading up to the American Revolution, he may have been the most famous person around, certainly in terms of the fact that he was famous on both the English continent, if you will, and that country, and the European continent, as well as in the American continent. And at the same time, there have been a lot of people that have written about the fact that it's possible that he really laid the groundwork for the American Revolution in, if nothing else, uniting the colonies together. Because although we'll talk about his time in Savannah, Georgia, and places like that, of course, he goes up to New England as well. There is a sense in which, whether we look at some of the ways in which evangelism is done today, some of that harkens all the way back to George Whitefield. We look at some of the influence, the spiritual influence on the American Revolution. He is a key figure. So we're going to come back and spend some time talking about who he was, why he's important, and if nothing else, encouraging you to learn a little bit more about American history. And if you want to learn about that, certainly one individual we point to from time to time is Thomas Kidd. You can learn more about such people as Patrick Henry. Of course, his ones on the Great Awakening also talk about Jonathan Edwards. But today we're going to spend some time talking about George Whitefield. We'll have more right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
For many years, we have seen how liberals and progressives on college campuses have been successful in shutting down dissent. We're now seeing more examples of this in all of society, especially after the Supreme Court's same-sex marriage decision. Now, a few newspapers say that they will no longer allow letters to the editor that oppose gay marriage because it's a fundamental right. Most news organizations have apparently adopted an editorial position that same-sex marriage is the only viable political position. And while we're talking about newspapers, some papers now refuse to print letters to the editor that question climate change. In the past, we have seen what happens to anyone who will not participate in a same-sex ceremony. Photographers, florists, bakers, and jewelers are on notice. They were the ones that refused in the past before the Supreme Court decision. Now gay activists are looking for anyone or any business that might actually now refuse. They will make an example of those people in order to shut down dissent. Consider what happened to Brandon Ike, a CEO of Mozilla, who donated $1,000 to Proposition 8, which is the California ballot measure defining traditional marriage. When it became public that he had given that donation, he was forced to resign. He has been used as a public example so that gay activists can shut down dissent. Catholic charities were forced out of the adoption business first in Massachusetts and now in other states. Although they could not in good conscience place a child in a home with same-sex couples, they were always willing to refer couples to an adoption agency that would do so. That was not enough. Gay activists and government officials could not allow even that limited amount of dissent. And don't forget Chick-fil-A. Mayors in cities like Boston and Chicago made it clear that this restaurant chain had no place in their cities because the family that owns the chain supports traditional marriage. You know, these attempts at shutting down dissent must be met with boldness, conviction, and discernment. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Thomas Kidd, author of a number of books. Also, of course, you have seen many of his writings that appeared in such things as World Magazine and USA Today. Holds a Ph.D. from the University of Notre Dame and is a professor of history at Baylor University. Thomas, let's, if we can, maybe talk about George Whitefield's early years. Born in an inn. He loved that because, after all, our Savior was born in a manger of an inn, and he makes a deal about that. Born in 1714, so just 300 years ago. Talk for just a minute about the time in which he was born. Of course, later he becomes one of the very important founders of Methodism with the Wesleys. But what was happening in England during that 18th century?
Well, there was a lot of conflict about religion and politics during that time. There was a great deal of turnover as far as whether England was going to be officially Catholic or Protestant. And so Whitefield, I think, saw what he was doing in his ministry very much as a proclamation of the gospel, but also a defense of Protestantism. And he was very attached for much of his career to the idea that Britain was a very important force for good and even godly purposes in the world. And I think that helps to explain certain references that he'll make occasionally to sort of strange anti-Catholic statements that to modern readers. What in the world is he saying that for? But he lives in a world that is torn up with religious violence and conflict.
And again, we have to remember there were the religious wars that they still had in their recent memory and all the rest. But there's something that you added, which I'm glad you did, and that is that he was somewhat restless in school but enjoyed play acting. And then later on, we felt like, you should really live in his aesthetic. At one point, he picks up a play and reads a funny passage, and the idea was to say how silly it was, but he said, God struck my heart. I've seen something very interesting, Thomas, and that is sometimes when I meet somebody who's really an outstanding evangelist or a really great pulpiteer, somebody's great in the pulpit, I oftentimes now, because I've found this to be sometimes the case, when you were in high school, were you ever in the drama club? There is something interesting about the fact that some of the really great communicators also had a background in acting. Of course, some people consider one of our better presidents was a former actor himself. So there's that connection with George Whitefield, isn't there?
There is, and I think it's an instance that God gives all believers spiritual gifts, and sometimes those gifts sync up with your natural talents that you had before your conversion. Sometimes they don't. But I think in Whitefield's case, it is quite obvious that he had a phenomenal talent for public speaking and public performance that God redeemed and used in Whitefield's ministry, much to the profit of the purposes of the kingdom and the gospel that he was preaching. People, previous biographers, academic biographers, have sometimes suggested that because of this background in the theater, that Whitefield was sort of all celebrity and public persona. And in other words, he was kind of a shell of a man and all theater. And I don't think that that's true either. But it is true, and every pastor knows this, that there is an aspect of public performance to speaking in the church or evangelistically. And Whitefield, for his time, was the absolute master.
And to maybe make a contrast, and I don't want to overplay this, again, there's nuances here, but if you were to take Jonathan Edwards, sometimes he would just read the manuscript, even when people are hearing Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I mean, he's reading a manuscript. Today, we take for granted that very few pastors will read their manuscript. Maybe that still happens in your academic world there, obviously, but they expect that you will make eye contact, there will be flourishes, there will be hand gestures and all the rest. So in some respects, George Whitefield was a little bit unusual in that regard, was he not? He
definitely was, and he is one of the first in his era to break out of the manuscript reading mode. And he tried to get John Wesley to do this, and John Wesley thought, this is highly irregular. You can't, no, this extemporaneous preaching, you just can't. And he said, no, we'll reach way more people if you loose yourself from the manuscript. Now, Whitefield, I think, is preaching sermons, especially as an itinerant. He's preaching sermons that he knows where he's going with it very well.
Right.
And has it probably memorized, basically. So it's not as if he's just up there, rambling about this and that. But he is turned loose from the manuscript, from the pulpit, and is able to go directly to the people and engage them in emotionally powerful ways that someone like an Edwards wasn't necessarily able to do all the time.
And again, the First Great Awakening, we certainly talk about both of those individuals with two very different kinds of styles who certainly were part of, and of course I believe it was the Holy Spirit that was part of, now we can bring our Christian perspective in here for that First Great Awakening, but it does show that, and again, part of that style, I guess we need to get him from England over to the United States because, or at that time, the colonies, because you were dealing with an individual that oftentimes was using open-air preaching. That means you have to have a pretty good voice because there's no microphones in that day, and you have to be able to carry and keep the attention of all of those individuals, some of whom may be very well educated, some maybe not so educated at all. And as a result of that, he was incredibly successful. And I've said before that if they back then had videos of George Whitefield crusade, and you watched it today, you'd say, well, it looked kind of like a Billy Graham crusade or a Greg Laurie crusade. But back then, that was very unusual. And a lot of things that we take for granted today in terms of some of our crusades, a lot of those harken back to him, don't they?
Well, absolutely, and the only difference to me is just that in his time, and you suggested this earlier, Whitefield is the best known person and absolutely dominates the media of his time.
Yes.
So that somebody like Billy Graham, is a major sensation in the 1950s and so forth. But Whitefield is the best known person in England and America at his time, and there's no one who's really even close. And so he has such a sensational effect on the culture, obviously the religion. And so early on in the 1730s, there are just tons of people who will come hear him speak just because he's so effective. And one of the main reasons he goes into the fields, first of all, is because the small churches hold the crowds.
That's right.
And so he goes out, and it's not too long before in London in particular, there are crowds being reported of 20, 30, 40,000, one time even 80,000 people, as you said, in a time before amplification. I mean, it's unlike anything anybody has ever seen. In the colonies, he's attracting crowds that are likely the largest crowds in the history of North America ever, by far. Mm-hmm. It's a sensation that I think it's hard to overstate how huge this was in the mid-18th century, not just in religious terms, but in cultural terms. He may be the first modern celebrity of any kind.
Yes, certainly first modern transatlantic celebrity for sure, first real celebrity, and again, the incredible impact, which I think right now, Thomas, is probably, we're coming to a break, some people are saying, why haven't I heard more about him? Well, first of all, that's why I think getting a copy of the book would be certainly worthwhile, but I think it illustrates again that we sort of moved on, if you will, and said, well, he's kind of a religious guy, so we won't cover him. And yet, when we come back from the break, I want to talk about the influence he had, because you said that he would attract all sorts of people. One of the friendships he developed is with Benjamin Franklin, who, to be candid, probably could not sign the doctrinal statement of the church that most of you attend on Sundays. But nevertheless, he and George Whitefield had an incredible relationship. And of course, he was one of the founders, if you will, of Methodism. So we'll talk about the connection with Wesley. And for our listeners in Savannah, Georgia, and South Carolina and other places, we'll talk about his involvement there. And for our listeners in New England, we'll talk about some of his teaching and preaching that takes place there as well. It's all part of the book, George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father. It is published by Yale University Press, and I think you would certainly want to get a copy of that. And we have an opportunity for you to find out a little bit more about it by going to our website. If you click on the picture of Thomas Kidd, that will take you to where he writes his blog, so you can find out a little bit more about him. If you click on a picture of the book, if you would want to order it, you could do so. It is more of an academic type book, so your Christian bookstore might have it, it might not, but we've made it easy for you to get a copy as well. As you go to the website, I did mention at the top of the program here that we are encouraging you to let your elected representatives know how you feel about these videos that have come out about Planned Parenthood. I think there is a very good reason to question whether or not we should send $528 million of our tax dollars to this organization. And if you agree with me, or even if you want to write a little different kind of note to your elected representatives, we've made it possible by going to the website pointofview.net. Click on that Take Action button, and we've given you all that you need in order to contact your two senators and your representative. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Thomas Kidd right after this.
Imagine you're in a room with 99 other people, 100 of you total. All of you listen to Point of View. You have that in common. What you don't have in common is that only one of you, actually less than 1 in 100, has ever supported the work of Point of View. That's what a recent study showed. 1 in 100. Fewer than 1% have given. 99% have not. You listen. So I know you appreciate what this program provides. Now, I invite you to move from the big group to the little one. If 1/3, 33% of those listening gives just $5 this week, we could fully fund Point of View for a year, 12 months. Not everyone will, not everyone can, but can you give $5 today, or maybe $55 or $105? Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Join the few, the thankful. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with about George Whitefield as we spend some time really looking at an individual who was a famous itinerant preacher, evangelist, and perhaps the first real celebrity on the North American continent, first for sure transatlantic celebrity, both in England and in the colonies. And the author of this is Dr. Thomas Kidd, as I mentioned before, professor of history at Baylor University, author of many books dealing with this. And Thomas, for just a minute, let's talk about Benjamin Franklin. I again find it so interesting that an individual like George Whitefield and Benjamin Franklin would be friends because they are very different. But I've also had heard that Benjamin Franklin even tried to estimate the crowd and see how easy it was to hear George Whitefield. You actually have that in your book where you talk about the fact that he, as an experiment, began to retire backwards until the Delaware River and found his voice distinct, and then he went to the front street and imagine his semicircle. He eventually was able to compute that probably more than 30,000 people were hearing George Whitefield. So first of all, kind of an interesting story, but also the fact that he was very supportive of George Whitefield, even if he didn't necessarily, as you say, actually convert and become a Christian.
Yeah, their relationship began as a business arrangement because Franklin was Whitefield's lead publisher in America. Mm-hmm. I think that Whitefield was looking for the best media people to work with, and honestly wasn't that concerned about whether they were evangelical Christians or not. And so he found Franklin, and they secured an arrangement where Franklin would publish his sermons and his journals and so forth in Philadelphia. And Franklin, I think, was ecstatic because he thought, I'm going to make a ton of money off of this guy. and he sure did. I think that Whitefield is probably a big part of the reason why Franklin was able to retire early because Franklin published all Whitefield stuff, and he published pro-Whitefield stuff, and he published anti-Whitefield stuff. And so he would just go always with it. But it wasn't too long before they would have to be in correspondence with each other, and they became friends. I think they kind of understood one another. Certainly, Whitefield was famous first, but certainly by the 1750s, Franklin was becoming an international celebrity himself. And so they kind of common experience of being very well known, and they would just have very frank discussions about religion and faith, and Franklin's lack of faith. And one of my very favorite letters between Whitefield and Franklin is from the 1750s when Whitefield is kind of kidding around with him, and he says, "Now, Mr. Franklin, I understand that you have made such great progress in studying the mysteries of electricity. Now I would encourage you to study the mysteries of the new birth."
Yes.
But, Franklin writes very openly about this in his autobiography, and he talks about how much he admired Whitefield, but he says that Whitefield used to pray for my conversion, but he never had the happiness of believing that his prayers had been answered. Mm. So it's kind of a sad note, and Whitefield dies much earlier than Franklin.
Individuals. One, of course, I mentioned was Wesley, and by this time Wesley's had come over, at least John Wesley had come over to Savannah, Georgia, and there was a time in which, of course, George Whitefield finds himself in kind of some of the southern colonies at that time, and talk about some of the things that happened there.
Yeah, well, the Wesley brothers and Whitefield had met at Oxford in the 1730s before any of them were converted, but they were sort of striving to be serious Christians. I think in retrospect, all of them would say they were kind of doing this in their own works, in the flesh. And Whitefield ended up converting in the mid-1730s. The Wesleys said that they hadn't had their conversion experience until after they had started to serve as missionaries in Georgia. So they convinced Whitefield to come to Georgia, and Whitefield decided that he would open an orphanage in Georgia to serve the children of the new colony of Georgia. And this became Whitefield's great charitable project of his life. And I think this is one of the reasons why Franklin liked Whitefield so much, is that Franklin believed in the ethical teachings of Christianity. He just didn't know about this business about Jesus' divinity and so forth. but he liked the idea that Whitefield lived out his faith in service to the poor and so forth. And so Whitefield ended up funneling a great deal of money to this Savannah orphanage, which is still in existence today.
Yes. Let's move to New England for just a minute, because we mentioned Jonathan Edwards, but he had an opportunity to actually go to where that revival kind of began, up in Northampton. And talk about that connection, too. That's an important one.
Well, Whitefield had read Jonathan Edwards' very famous account of the Northampton revival from the mid-1730s. That revival happened about the same time that Whitefield was accepting Christ at Oxford. And so Whitefield was very eager to go out of his way to meet Edwards if he could. And so perhaps the greatest success of all of Whitefield's career was his revivals that he led in New England, especially centered in Boston in the fall of 1740, and then in what it must have just been a remarkable historical moment. In October of 1740, Edwards and Whitefield met, and Whitefield preached at the Northampton Meeting House to great results, and as part of that new revival, even some of Edwards' own children accepted Christ for the first time.
Just an incredible story that takes place. This was all taking place at a time when there were at least two issues I thought it would be appropriate to address, and you talk about them in your book. We'll talk about the American Revolution in just a minute, because this precedes this. The Great Awakening precedes the American Revolution. But the other issue is slavery, and this was here is an individual that has been both in the South and in of course, the New England area. And, of course, we know Benjamin Franklin having spoken to that issue, and Benjamin Rush and the Adams and others. Talk about George Whitefield, because even though he was an evangelist, he still had his mindset looking at what was happening in some of the political realm, and slavery is, of course, the big issue of the day.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest challenges I had writing the biography, because I like Whitefield a lot, and I really admire his ministry, and one of his greatest blind spots, I think his greatest ethical problem, is that even though he spoke out against the abuse of slaves in the South, he did not question the institution of slavery itself, and went on by the mid-1740s to own slaves personally. And he didn't really have anybody around him who was pushing him on this issue. He didn't see in the Bible that there was just a "thou shalt not own slaves" verse. Obviously, we believe. And he just didn't get it. He didn't get it, and even when he died, he deeded his slaves to other people. And so it shows that as wonderful of a ministry as he had, he was still very much a man of his time. And I think sometimes historically we just have to be patient with people like that.
Yes, well, and again, when you think of, I don't know if he ever came in contact with John Newton, but he certainly was in contact with, of course, with the Wesleys, and he was in contact with Benjamin Franklin, and he was in Philadelphia, so probably knew Benjamin Rush. I mean, he probably was around a lot of individuals, either in England or in the colonies, who were abolitionists. And it's amazing to see that, again, I guess, as you said, we all have a blind spot, but it is one of those kind of puzzles to me, and I'm glad to know that after you've read all those articles and read all those letters, you can't figure it out any more than I can. Yeah,
well, and we have to remember Franklin owned slaves. At the same time that Whitefield owned slaves, Franklin owned slaves. I mean, you remember that Franklin, came out as an abolitionist later. Right. Wesley came out against slavery after Whitefield's death. Newton came out against slavery after Whitefield's death.
Oh, that answers a lot. I didn't realize that. Okay.
So thinking about the chronology, Whitefield just has almost no one around him who's pushing him about this. And I think that's what he would have needed.
Well, and you've now answered a question. I had not looked at all the dates and everything and put all that together. Let's take a break. When we come back, then I'd love to get to the other obvious part of that, and that is the subtitle of this book is America's Spiritual Founding Father. There is obviously a connection between the First Great Awakening and the American Revolution. You've written two other books on it, so obviously this will be familiar territory for some of our listeners, but I thought it would be good to talk about the impact of the Jonathan Edwards and the George George Whitefield's and others and the Great Awakening on the American Revolution. And so we'll take a break and come back and focus our time and attention on that. If you just joined us, we're talking today with Dr. Thomas Kidd. He has written quite a number of books that I would commend to you. In the past, we've talked about his book on Patrick Henry and God of Liberty, the Religious History of the American Revolution. I just alluded to a few of those on the Great Awakening. He's written on quite a number of others. You probably have seen some of his articles in World Magazine or even in USA Today. We're just privileged to have him with us. It is a book about 300 pages published by Yale University Press, and it's entitled George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about the influence of George Whitefield and the First Great Awakening on the founding of the country and the framing of our Constitution. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thomas Kidd with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his new book, George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father. Let's talk about the connection, if any, between the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening, and the American Revolution. I know that Paul Johnson, in his book, History of the American People, makes a real connection between the First Great Awakening and the American Revolution. You've written about the Great Awakenings in the past, especially the First Great Awakening. What are the connections, if any, between this religious time, this revival, the awakenings that took place, and then the subsequent American Revolution?
Well, I think we have to remember that the Great Awakening is the greatest social and cultural upheaval in American colonial history, period. and it's happening 30 years before the coming of the Revolution. And it's not just a quaint religious affair, the awakening. It's also an uprising of the people against the established authorities, especially in the form of the state-backed churches and their pastors, a lot of whom come under certainly verbal attack during the Great Awakening, because people, including Whitefield, raised the prospect that some of these pastors who are on the government payroll are just time servers, and that they may not even be born again themselves. The pastors had never come under this kind of treatment before, and understandably, they did not like it. There were episodes where there were riots in the cities associated with the Great Awakening, and one episode in Hartford, Connecticut, they even had to call out the colonial militia to put down the rioters, the evangelical rioters. So there are scenes happening that look kind of revolutionary, and they're happening just 30 years before the Revolution. Now, I do want to say that we could overstate this. I mean, the Revolution, it seems to me, had something to do with, like, taxes and politics.
Oh, sure, no doubt.
But there's this kind of conditioning effect that the Great Awakening, I think, gives the people of the colonies a public voice and ideas that they don't necessarily have to do what the government tells them to do. And I think the Great Awakening is the first really profound experience in American colonial history that does that for the American people.
And if I can pull from your book on Patrick Henry, we can look at all sorts of individuals, but we'll just pick on him for a minute since you've written about him. There was a very definite connection between the political and the religious, between the faith and the concerns about what is happening. And today, when you have, if some go to a very secular school and have kind of a revisionist idea, you lose that part of it. I recognize there were lots of reasons for the American Revolution, but the religious part of it has been written about by you, but sometimes neglected by some of those that certainly ignore the very significant power of these religious ideas of the revival, and even of seeing themselves maybe disconnected from the colonial powers because of beliefs in such things as civil disobedience and those kinds of ideas. So it does seem to me that all of those are relevant factors, and I appreciate the fact that you write about them and help us to understand that that's another part, and a very important part, of why we had the American Revolution.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you look at just an example of Patrick Henry, who gives the most important speech of the American Revolution, his Liberty or Death speech. That speech, we know now, is shot through with references to the Bible, even though he doesn't give chapter and verse, especially the prophet Jeremiah. In a relatively short speech, there are constant references to the Bible, and it's no coincidence that Henry had attended many revival meetings in the Great Awakening, and people would grumble about Henry, and they would say, that Patrick Henry, he must think he's a preacher or something, the way that he talks. And so that you can see that conditioning effect, that resistance for Americans during that time often comes through religious ideas and religious rhetoric. Where did they get it? A lot of times it's coming from the Great Awakening.
One more I might put on the table, and that is I've heard some people write that up until the first Great Awakening, colonists tended to be separated. In other words, if you were the colony of Massachusetts, you would report back to England. If you're in the colony of Georgia, you report back to England. But now, because George Whitefield had kind of traveled up and down the eastern seaboard, they began to see themselves as fellow colonists, as if you will, Americans. And that may have helped as well, rather than see 13 discrete and distinct and almost independent colonies. They began to see themselves in a structural way that maybe also allowed for the American Revolution.
I think that there's something to that. I mean, there's certainly nothing like Whitefield's preaching to give the colonists a common religious and cultural experience and vocabulary. I mean, he's everywhere, and he's been seen by more people. His stuff has been read by more people than way more than any figure at the time. And Whitefield is indicating in the 1760s, in notable instances, of sympathy for the colonists' plight. His friend Ben Franklin testifies against the Stamp Act in 1766 before Parliament, And what is little known is that Whitefield was there when Franklin testified before Parliament.
Wow.
Whitefield was there showing his support. Now, what would Whitefield have done about the revolution? That we're not sure, because he dies in 1770. So he's sort of off the hook. But, there's an undeniable conditioning influence that's coming out of the awakening that influences the rank and file patriots.
Well, just about out of time, and I wanted, Thomas, for just a minute to have people know how they can contact you, read your blogs, read some of the other books and resources. We have one link there that is on our website, but if people want to know a little bit more, or if we have some students listening that are thinking of going off to college and majoring in history, give us some advice there, too.
Well, Baylor University is a great option. And, of course, there are many, many great Christian colleges and universities. And, of course, I as a Christian, cut my teeth at a public university in South Carolina. So you can do more about me. I'm on Facebook and Twitter at Thomas S. Kidd. And you also provided a link to the Anxious Bench blog at patheos.com, where I blog every week. And any of my books, you can certainly find out information on Amazon.com at my author page there, Thomas S. Kidd.
Just mention next to your name, we do have a Twitter and Facebook link, so people can find that as well. And just before you go, almost every time I've had John Fee on, John Fee,
I do.
Why Study History? We always say, you can do just quite well majoring in history. I have a son that graduated in history, and he's done quite well. So I want to encourage some of our young people out there to recognize that being a history major isn't a dead end. You don't have to be a history professor, which you are, or a history teacher, which many are, but it's just a great way to learn, to read, to learn how to analyze, synthesize, to learn how to write. If I'm individual looking for somebody that will do well in my company, I think somebody with a history degree is somebody that should be considered. What do you think?
Oh, I totally agree, and I think it's becoming much more common for businesses, even medical schools, to be looking for liberal arts majors, because so often the reality of work, and people in the audience who have jobs know this full well, you usually learn what you need to know on the job.
That's right.
Instead of college. The best thing college can do for you is to help you become an educated, learned person who can think with the great texts of the past, great heroes of the past, and history is one of the best disciplines to do that through.
I think so. Again, the book is entitled George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father, published by Yale University Press. And Thomas, always great to have you in the program. Let's do it again sometime.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what it means to be an agent of redemption. Dr. Albert Reyes will be with us. The Jesus Agenda, he will about some of the issues in the news, but we will get back to those in more detail tomorrow. But I thought it'd be a nice mental break as we are in the summer. So we're going to take that short break, and then, of course, we'll be back into the news cycle tomorrow. Let's take a break. We'll find out more about how to become an agent of redemption. All that coming up right after this.
What can you get for $5? In most cases, you can't even get a value meal at a fast food restaurant. But I'll tell you one thing $5 can do. If every listener to Point of View sent just $5 this week, believe it or not, and someone here did the math, Point of View could pay the bills for the next 3 years. That's what the number said. $5, 3 years. That's how many of you there are and how little it takes to keep us going. The problem is, most of our listeners have never contributed. Never. To make up for those who don't, others give large gifts, hundreds, even thousands, or monthly donations of $30, $65, $100. I don't know what you can do, but I encourage you to do what you can today, even if that's $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Thank you for doing your part for Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour, we're going to spend some time today talking about becoming an agent of redemption, and we'll get into all the details of what that means in just a minute. New book out called The Jesus Agenda, and if you go to our website, you can see that we give you information about that in case you would like to order it. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to find that, and we also have some articles that relate to it to give you a chance to understand more about that. In studio with me today is Dr. Albert Reyes, and he is the president and CEO of Buckner International. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. It's a history that goes all the way back to the 19th century of Pastor Buckner, and I'll talk about that with him in just a minute. Individual that has traveled all over the United States and to countries around the world and really trying to reach out to those sometimes in the poorest communities on the planet. Has a bachelor's degree in business administration from Angelo State University, also a master's of divinity and doctor of divinity degree in missiology from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a doctor of philosophy degree in global leadership from Andrews University. He also speaks at a number of universities around the country. I'll give you some more of his bio as we go along, and it's also on the website. Dr. Reyes, great to have you in studio.
Great to be here, Kirby. Thank you.
I might just mention for our listeners that Buckner International is located here, so we'll talk about that in just a moment, but also want to get your testimony. But maybe we should spend a little bit of time talking about Buckner International. I gave a little bit of the history, and occasionally we've mentioned it, and we talked about the Buckner's Boy ranch and a few things like that. But you go all the way back to the 19th century with this Baptist pastor, Pastor Buckner, that had this vision, and you today are running organizations. I think last time I looked, $74 million annual budget or something like that.
Right.
Just amazing, which is one of the reasons why I want to get you back to talk about leadership, because you are leading a very large organization. But talk about the Buckner history a little bit for us, if you might.
Well, Kirby, it's a fascinating history. It goes back to right after the Civil War. In fact, it was 1859 when R.C. Buckner, Robert Cook Buckner, who was from Madisonville, Tennessee, a pastor in Kentucky, made his way to Paris, Texas. And the year that he rolled in across the border on his wagon, there was a man running for governor that year by the name of General Sam Houston.
Sam Houston.
And so at the very beginnings of Texas history, R.C. Buckner was part of that. And for about 20 years, he continued to pastor and serve, and was a missionary and did preaching and did a number of ministry. He even developed a newspaper that he published called The Religious Messenger, which, by the way, being in journalism and communication media, he ran it at for profit. So it did generate income, but it was to all the different churches across the state of Texas, primarily Baptist, but other religions as well, other denominations. And so his purpose in doing that magazine was to eventually, there was a strategy behind it, call together the leaders of the churches across Texas to say, we've got to do something about the children whose fathers went off to the war and didn't come back, mothers that are left as widows, and some of them didn't survive. So you have really true orphans where both parents died. And so he convened a meeting there in 1877 at the First Baptist Church of Paris, and he had a small and called together some of the leaders and said, to get this started, I'm going to put the first dollar in the hat, and they passed it around. The second person that put $1 in was B.H. Carroll, the founder of Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth. And so they collected $27, took that into the meeting where he preached, and then they collected about $200 that day. And they said, when you get to 2,000, you can start. So it took about another 2 years. They finally got to $2,000 and started the Buckner Orphans Home, 1879, right in Dallas, Texas, 136 years ago.
Yes. Well, there's a lot more that you're doing now. I mean, people that know Shoes for Orphan Souls, they might know that. I recognize that a lot of our listeners outside of the state of Texas may have never heard of Buckner International, but they might have heard about some of the programs, and that's one that I would think many of our listeners might have heard about, right?
That is true, and it's a program that just about anybody, individuals, kids who have birthday parties, churches, civic groups can participate. It's about collecting brand new shoes and shipping them to Buckner. And I know that there have been shoe drives in radio stations across the U.S. that have participated in something like this. And sometimes some of the volunteers have gone actually on the trip to place kids' shoes on the children's feet. And it's really something to get on your knees in front of a child, wash their feet, dry their feet, put new socks and brand new shoes on. I mean, I've rehearsed that over and over with my own kids, and the joy is the same. Kids are ready to jump and run faster than before. But what a picture of getting in a posture of servanthood in front of a child, the least of these, a child. It's just fantastic.
Let's see if we can also talk about your story just a little bit, because it's part of the book.
Right.
Sometimes when I do interviews, we just get right into the topic, and then you get to know the person as we go along. But your story is really key to this, because if you go to a typical seminary, the idea is, well, we're going to preach the gospel. Right. And so evangelism is going to be key, and church discipline and church discipleship and maybe church growth. Those are the key issues. Social service, well, that's kind of secondary. And you came to recognize that maybe you needed to change some of that. And that's really part of the book called The Jesus Agenda, isn't it?
Right. That's true, Kirby. This kind of came to me from several different streams of knowledge and experience. One is that I had to reflect back on my own pilgrimage, our own history of our family, who were really the least of these, struggling in poverty and just barely making ends meet. My grandfather did that with his wife and 9 kids. My dad was among them, who worked cotton, and so they didn't have a very good start. And like many families in the U.S., parents come here, they struggle to get going, and so there was a preacher who came and gathered the migrant workers together and preached the gospel to them. And my grandmother is the one who first responded to the gospel in 1932, Reverend Edward P. Gonzalez. And so he preached the gospel, they received it, and then over time the family was discipled, but there was also needs that were met along the way, and the churches were instrumental in that. And I used to think that while my seminary education was great, we didn't spend much time on what do you do between Sundays to help people.
Right.
I think that was done, and probably I did some of that, but didn't really see it as my department or my responsibility until I studied Robert Cook Buckner, and I realized that he was a preacher, evangelist. He did revivals and baptized people that came to know the Lord, but at the same time, he was disturbed by what he saw in his community, and he did something about it. Many people don't know that he wrote the child labor laws for the state of Texas.
Wow.
And he developed the Dallas Humane Society that was for the fair and humane treatment of cats and dogs and horses and cows and children. And so why would you have to have a Dallas Humane Society for children? Well, the story behind that is that children were used as laborers in the mines and different industry in the Dallas area. And when one child died, they'd bury that one and replace it with another. And he said that's not right. And so he was instrumental in making a difference, taking the gospel and what it meant and making an incarnational presence. And that's why he made the world different where he was.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, talk a little bit about that, because what about redemption in the Old Testament? What about redemption in the New Testament? What does that mean? And again, I think you have certainly covered some of that very well. A paternal grandfather was an orphan and struggled to earn a living as a migrant farm worker, a father picking cotton, and even when you graduated, a pastor in an economically challenged area. But how that has affected your thinking and how it should affect our thinking as well. We will get into this about what it really means to exercise redemption and utilize that in a gospel way. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
For many years, we have seen how liberals and progressives on college campuses have been successful in shutting down dissent. We're now seeing more examples of this in all of society, especially after the Supreme Court's same-sex marriage decision. Now, a few newspapers say that they will no longer allow letters to the editor that oppose gay marriage because it's a fundamental right. Most news organizations have apparently adopted an editorial position that same-sex marriage is the only viable political position. And while we're talking about newspapers, some papers now refuse to print letters to the editor that question climate change. In the past, we have seen what happens to anyone who will not participate in a same-sex ceremony. Photographers, florists were the ones that refused in the past before the Supreme Court decision. Now gay activists are looking for anyone or any business that might actually now refuse. They will make an example of those people in order to shut down dissent. Consider what happened to Brandon Ike, a CEO of Mozilla, who donated $1,000 to Proposition 8, which is the California ballot measure defining traditional marriage. When it became public that he had given that donation, he was forced to resign. He has been used as a public example so that gay activists can shut down dissent. Catholic charities were forced out of the adoption business first in Massachusetts and now in other states. Although they could not in good conscience place a child in a home with same-sex couples, they were always willing to refer couples to an adoption agency that would do so. That was not enough. Gay activists and government officials could not allow even that limited amount of dissent. And don't forget Chick-fil-A. Mayors in cities like Boston and Chicago made it clear that this restaurant chain had no place in their cities because the family that owns the chain supports traditional marriage. You know, these attempts at shutting down dissent must be met with boldness, conviction, and discernment. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Albert Reyes, and his book is entitled The Jesus Agenda, Becoming an Agent of Redemption. If you'd like to join us, we'll open up the phones a little bit later because I know we'll be getting into questions about evangelism, social service, and maybe you're struggling with how to put those together. Maybe you would like to know what your church could do or what you as an individual can do. We'll get into all of this. But I guess the first key, Dr. Reyes, is define redemption. Take us to the book of Luke, because that, I think, is one of the passages that you made so important there. Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That looks like a little bit more than just standing up there and giving a gospel message, right?
That is true. It's incarnational. It is an agenda. It's an outline of what Jesus announced he would do during his first sermon that he preached in public in Nazareth in the synagogue. And, you know, whenever a elected person takes office or the president is sworn in to defend the Constitution of the United States, and you know, the ceremony happens and the president then gives a speech. It's an inaugural speech. And he outlines what he plans to do, and he demonstrates that in 100 days, you know. So it's his inaugural speech that lays out the agenda. I think this is kind of what Jesus did in his very first sermon. He reaches over and takes from the attendant the book of Isaiah, reads from the scroll, and he quotes that passage where he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, the Spirit has anointed me. And then he lays out 5 activities, you know, to preach good news to the poor, to give sight to the blind, to give liberty to the oppressed, freedom for the captives, and then to proclaim the Lord's favor. So I listen to that and I say, okay, so here's the Lord Jesus who's doing his first sermon. I'm really paying attention to what he's saying because he's outlining what he's going to do. And then he us and resurrected and so on. The church is formed after that. So shouldn't the church and shouldn't I, as a follower of Jesus, kind of take clues from what Jesus said at the very beginning of his ministry? I mean, what would it mean today to give good news to the poor? What would good news be for a poor person? What would it mean for someone who has a physical problem, their sight has been lost, or someone who's suffering under oppressive situation? You know, what would it be for them to have freedom and so on? And so I think we have to ask those questions and then personalize it to our own experience. And so that's when we begin to see Sunday morning collide with the rest of the week, because you know what, there are people that are poor, there are people that are suffering from oppression, there are people that are physically hurt, and you know, what are we going to do? Just kind of like ignore that core message of Jesus? So that's where it started to really stir in my own heart.
Let me add to something. I would think you would agree, but you're welcome to disagree, that this is all the more reason why I think the church needs to get involved. One, because it's biblically justifiable, but two, because of the failure that we've seen out here. Dr. Reyes, over the last few months, we've talked about, we just had the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. And as if I can quote Ronald Reagan, we had a war on poverty and poverty won. We just last Sunday just had the anniversary of the Americans Disability Act, which has certainly been good in terms of providing access to buildings. But when you look at some of the other failures, you have to say we haven't always done such a good job when we've depended upon the government. And it's been my conviction that I think that faith-based organizations, whether it's a Christian group or whether it's a church, can do a better job of addressing issues like poverty and disability, because some of those issues are not economic, they're spiritual and psychological. What are your thoughts?
I think certainly, you know, Jesus said the poor will always be with you, and they still are, you know, but that doesn't mean we should ignore them. Yeah. We should do something, and certainly we in ministries and churches are close to people who need the help. We have the delivery system in place. We probably have locations around the world in every city and village, and so the church certainly is at the cutting edge of redemptive work that God's doing, and we're in a good position to help people. And yet I find that you can help an individual and make things better, but if the spiritual issues aren't addressed, those helps and those improvements may not last. We're physical, we're spiritual, we're emotional, and those issues that really arrange the way we think have to be addressed in the spiritual. That's why we offer spiritual development and opportunity as we deliver programs and services.
Sure makes a lot more sense than just throwing money at a problem or having bureaucrats deal with it. You certainly have degrees from Southwestern Baptist seminaries. Let's talk about what redemption looks like first in the Old Testament and then in the New Testament. You have whole chapters on that. And it does seem to me that we have a pretty good model. Let's start with the Old Testament about what redemption means when we look at Joseph and Moses and Abraham. Talk us through that for a minute.
I take some time in the chapter there wanting to trace what does redemption look like in the Old Testament, and then what does it look like in the New Testament, to give us a good biblical foundation for that picture of what it means now today. And I could sum up the Old Testament in the story of Joseph. You get there in Genesis at the very end of that chapter, and it's real interesting that, this is the Joseph whose brothers, they had some dysfunction in their family and favoritism, and so they end up sort of getting him and wanting to plot to murder him, actually the murder plot, but then that's foiled, and they put him in a well to then pull him out later and sell him to a caravan. He gets taken on to Egypt and is put into human trafficking, into forced labor. So he's serving there. Then he's falsely accused of sexual impropriety, and then thrown into jail again, unjustly put into captivity once again, and then forgotten. And then finally, he brought out of that and goes in the service of the government and makes a huge difference in the trajectory of the country. Well, at the very end, those same brothers, when their father died, brought a letter to him and said, actually they sent a letter through messenger from their father who was already dead. So here's a letter from the grave that says, forgive your brothers, don't harm them for the bad things they did to you. Isaac was aware of that. And so once Joseph got the letter, he began to cry and sent for his brothers. And they came in. The scripture says that they fell on their faces before Joseph, and they said together, "We are your slaves." Mm-hmm. So I stopped there and I think, wait a minute. Aren't these the brothers that made him a slave? You know, God is the God of the great reversal.
Yes.
If you just put things in his hands, you know, he has a way of switching things around. He has a way of protecting us when we don't know we need protecting. So here we are at that tender conversation. Joseph then says, you know, brothers, get up. I'm not God. He says, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, even the saving of ourselves in this nation. And so that's the picture of redemption for me, that, you know, things have happened in your life, in my life, and probably the lives of our listeners where someone has talked bad about them, someone has stabbed them in the back, someone has treated them wrongly. Sometimes we get ourselves into trouble, sometimes it happens to us, but regardless of how it came to us, the good message is that what was intended to harm us, those very things, God intends them for good. That's the story. He redeems. He makes all things new. It's Romans 8:28.
Right.
And
Romans 8:28.
He makes it good. He makes it right. And so you know what? We don't have to worry about that stuff. Just trust in God and try to serve him. And you'll see that over your lifespan, you'll be able to say, well, that was intended to harm you, but look what God did with it.
Yes. We have to take a break, but I just might mention in the Old Testament you have sections on Abraham. Right. You mentioned Joseph, of course. I mentioned Moses. So another one would be Ruth. Certainly. Right. And then when we come back, let's talk about redemption in the New Testament. I'm thinking Zacchaeus is a good example, don't you think, there, as well as, of course, the Philippian jailer and a few others. So there are just a lot of things that can be used in terms of understanding redemption. Sure. But I wanted to encourage our listeners, if they would like to kind of think through how they put all of this together. This is a book called The Jesus Agenda, Becoming an Agent of Redemption. It's published by Believers Press. Now, you might be able to find that, but it'd probably just be simpler for us to point you, as we do, to Buckner International. And we also have a place where you can order the book. And I think it would be a great conversation starter for you and your community, about 180 pages. It has some questions and things like that. I might even identify to some of you that are Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders, this might be a good way to say, okay, we believe that the gospel is certainly evangelism, but what else does it involve, and what kind of discussion can we have? So it's a great resource that I think you might want to have. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me open up the phones. We've only covered a little bit of the book, but already you probably might have a comment or question. And if you'd like to do so, you are free to do so, 1-800-351-1212. If not, you might want to sit back and take some notes, because we've worked your way through the issue of redemption and redemption in the Old Testament. Let's look at redemption in the New Testament and see what it looks like here in the 21st century. So we're going to give you some opportunity here to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you go to the website, you will see that we have a number of links, and one of those, of course, will take you to JesusAgenda.org. That's the easiest place to find the book. But we also have links to Buckner International. If you're not familiar with that organization, you can find out more there as well. And if you'd like to correspond with Dr. Reyes personally and find out maybe how they could set up something to deal with these issues, we certainly would encourage you to do that as well. Also put a nice question and answer piece that was produced so that you can read a little bit about the book before you order it. It's all on the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation today, talking about the relationship between evangelism and social action, and perhaps that's a question that you've always had if you're dealing with that, or perhaps have a positive example that takes place in your community and your church. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Albert Reyes with us as we talk about his book, The Jesus Agenda. And we talked about redemption in the Old Testament. How about redemption in the New Testament? I mentioned Zacchaeus. You can pick any of the ones, but I thought that's a pretty good example of somebody who was completely redeemed because of what took place.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. I thought about picking people that we all know about, the big giants of the faith, but I wanted to go with people that are kind of more like us. We're all sinners, and so redeemed by God's grace. And here's a guy who just stole from people, and was considered like low life. You don't want to be around these kind of people. And Jesus yet visited him, came into his circle of living, and had dinner with him. And, somehow in that course of that conversation over dinner, Zacchaeus jumps up. He just jumps up, and the word is in the original language is that he jumped up as if to make an announcement of some news. And he says, today, Master, I want to pay back. If I've robbed someone, I want to pay them back 4 times. And so Jesus says, today, salvation has come to this house, So so what happened in the conversation? How did they get to that? Was it before dessert or after dessert, And so there's an example of those things that were wrong in his life. And through connection with Jesus, his life is turned around. And now he wants Philippian jailer. I mean, he was the one who they say that, Roman soldiers never die. They simply retire at Philippi. Well, you got to retire if you were good at dismembering people in warfare. That's how you survived. And here's a man who put wounds on Paul, in jail. And now he's nursing his wounds. And so that's transformation. That's the redemption of a life.
I might just really recommend to our listeners that this would be just some great things for teaching in a Sunday school class or for pastors, that as you come across the Samaritan woman, you come across the Zacchaeus or the Philippian jailer or many of the other examples you have in here, these would be wonderful teaching moments on the idea of redemption. Well, let's, if we can, maybe answer another question that you have in the book. What does an agent of redemption look like? What does that look like, especially in the 21st century?
Sure. The whole point of the book is to really activate people in Bible study groups, in community groups, cell groups, Sunday school classes that are sitting in the pew and in the class, wondering from week to week, what really is the purpose of my life? And my goal, my hope is that in studying this book and the concept, that everyday people could realize that their hands and feet involved in the begin to help the redemption of that individual, and they're used by God, used by the Lord to help them. They become agents of redemption. Now we're clear that Jesus does the redeeming. We understand that. But when we find a family for a child, or when we find a family for a foster child, a forever family through adoption, or whenever we help a mom or a dad strengthen their family to get stronger, we really are agents of their redemption as well. And Jesus is using us in that process.
It seems to me that that's what we should do. What about redemption? What does that look like in the local village and then in the global village? I mean, there's two different things. A lot of people right now say, well, I'm in Stockton, California. I'm in maybe Savannah, Georgia. We mentioned that one in the first hour. Or, I might find myself in Peoria, Illinois, or wherever it might be. And I'm saying, well, what does that look like here? I mean, what does that look like in my local community? Can you give us some ideas?
Sure. I know that throughout Texas and probably in other states across the country, there are faith-based organizations that find homes for children through foster care, through adoption. We do that here in Texas, primarily here, and through foster care, foster group care, adoption. Last year there were 17,000 children that were out of home placement. They were living in a place outside their original home, and they were waiting for a family. All adoption providers together, faith-based and otherwise, were able to place about 4,800 children into homes, and that's great. We celebrate that, but there's another 12,000 that would like to be in a home. And so being an agent of their redemption is simply opening up your home and saying there's room at the table for one more. There's another bed, and we can be the family for you. And in that context, they grow up to know the love of God in practical ways. They get exposed to the gospel, come to know the Lord, discipled, and who knows who they can become. You don't know who you're helping when you're being an agent of redemption eventually.
Yes. Just for a minute, I know this is a little bit of a side trail, but it's one we've been talking about. In light of the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, a lot of adoption agencies now are saying, we've got a problem here, because we saw what happened to Catholic Charities in Massachusetts, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have listeners in Massachusetts. They know the story very and immediately came to Catholic Charities and say, well, because of that now, then you have to place children in homes with same-sex couples. And so Catholic Charities came back and said, well, we can't really do that, and we have never done that before, but what we always do is if we have a couple that are homosexuals come to us, we will refer them to another agency. And the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said, not good enough, and so they closed down Catholic Charities after it was in existence almost as long as you've been in existence, more than 100 years.
Right.
This is going to be a real challenge now for adoption agencies, isn't it?
I think so. For faith-based organizations that rely on government support for these kinds of programs are going to be in a position where they have to kind of decide what they're going to do. Now, ironically, here in Texas, faith-based adoption and foster care agencies represent about 25% of total providers. So 75% of the providers are not in this zone of having their work that's governed by their religious convictions and beliefs. And so there's plenty of room for people to access and to have a home if they don't have the same beliefs as we do. There's no one's minimizing anybody's ability or access to get there if you have 75% providers available. And so I think ultimately this question may come to the intersection of religious freedom and the same-sex marriage law that's just been passed by the ruling that's been given by the Supreme Court. So those conversations are yet to be defined.
I know. And so, again, we certainly encourage people to pray for Buckner International and many of these others.
Right.
Well, we're talking about being involved in redemption in the local community. You talk a little bit about these family hope centers. Talk about that for just a minute.
Yes. We mentioned a moment ago about foster care and adoption, and that's really about child permanency is what we call it.
Mm-hmm.
The other is family preservation. We have two programs. One of them is the Family Hope Center. We figured out if we could get to families that are struggling before they disintegrate and help make them stronger and keep the family as an integrated whole, then we don't have to use services like foster care and adoption. Children stay with their family. We think the best place for a child is with their family versus an institutional setting or any other kind of care. A good, healthy, safe environment with a Christ-centered focus, that's the best place for a child to grow up, we believe. And so the Family Hope Center is a place where families come who are hurting and that have acute needs that we deal with. But if they let us on a voluntary basis, they're allowed to go deeper into intensive case management, where we really dig deep below the level to find out the reasons for putting them in that, for them getting that situation. Sometimes it's places that might be clean water, sanitary conditions, or food. It's a number of different things that the family needs, and we provide those services according to what they need, so that ultimately they get stronger, and then they don't need our services anymore, and they go on and do well.
If somebody wanted to implement something like that in their community, because again, I want to take some of the things you've learned here in Dallas and have, in a sense, give them a national exposure. Can they contact you at Buckner and find out what that looks like and everything?
Sure. We would be glad to share our model. There's not enough of us, helping. So we share best practices and say, here's how we do it. Here's the model. And maybe it could be improved upon somewhere else. But we started it in Guatemala, and we realized that it worked, and we thought, could this work in the U.S.? And sure enough, we exported the model here, and we were working here in Dallas as well as in the Lower Grand Valley. This could work anywhere there's needy families that are really struggling, bringing all the resources together to tap into and fill the gaps of their needs.
Let's take a break, but get something to write with, because when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the resources that are available through Buckner International. And I've left one out. We haven't talked about redemption in the global village, and that's another aspect of what you do as well. So I think this is one of those examples of where we'd like to take some things that have worked well, as you said, best practices, and export them. And those of you listening in other parts of the country that are looking to try to make a positive difference, these are some resources that we want to make available to you. So we're going to give you some websites and some other resources. Of course, we already have a couple of links there, as well as information about the book, The Jesus Agenda. There's a place where you can order it. And also, I posted a series of question and answers that your friends at the Barnabas Agency put together, so that people can read that and get a little bit of an understanding of what the book is about before they look for it. And so those resources are available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's come back. We'll talk a little bit more about where some of those resources are available, and what about redemption in the global village. That coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Albert Reyes, and as we talk about his book, The Jesus Agenda, let me just mention that if you wanted to listen to this again, or maybe you know somebody who would need to hear this, of course, we make available the podcast, or if they'd like to see Dr. Reyes in studio, the Livecast, they can get either one. The video or the podcast is available, and you can then click the share button and send it to someone else and say, this is something maybe you need to know about. And if you're aware of people that are involved in some kind of social service or church ministry, looking for some ways to make a difference, I want them to learn from you. And Dr. Reyes, talk for just a few minutes what is available at Buckner International, including this book. I've been mentioning that this might be something that a pastor would want to preach through, that a Sunday school leader might want to use in terms of a small group discussion. So talk about what's available.
Sure. We have resources, other booklets, and how we have a responsibility to serve them. We also have, during the Christmas season, the Advent guide, the devotional guide that we send out free of charge, that kind of walks you through all the days of Advent, and different writers from across our ministry and volunteers write. So those are also available on a complimentary basis. The book, I hope, could be an excellent resource for Bible study groups, Sunday school classes, home groups, cell groups. Even if a pastor wanted to read through it and preach from it, there's at the end of each chapter, there are 3 or 4 questions that get you to really reflect on the biblical foundation of each chapter. And so it gives opportunity for folks to read through it as a group, individually, or even as a reference guide for preaching.
I think it'd be wonderful for a small group, because on this one in particular here, I have 5 different questions. I mean, it's just perfect. Just if you're looking for some kind of small group study to do. We've talked about what redemption is, redemption in the Old Testament, the New Testament. We're going to talk in just a minute about redemption in the global village. We just talked about it, the local village. And then you have some profiles in compassion and conviction and courage, which we won't get to today, but you can see that in about 180 pages, you cover it pretty well. But just to make sure that we cover at least the last part, obviously, a lot of us are focused on our local community, but what does redemption look like in terms of our global village?
Sure. You know, Kirby, there are 151 million orphans in the world today. That number has not shrunk since I've gotten into this kind of ministry. And I've met some of the children that we're talking about where they've lost one or both parents. Sometimes they're social orphans where the parents are living, but they don't have enough resources to take care of the child. But it doesn't take much imagination to go into developing countries around the world. We're in 8 of them currently, and there's so many things that could be done, such as collecting shoes, taking brand new shoes to children, putting shoes on their feet, doing vacation Bible school, Bible stories, or even in some places just going to play with children and just be with them and have an adult person talk to them. It shows that we care and that they matter. You know, you might think, well, what difference does a pair of shoes make? $20 pair of shoes that you can buy at the store. Well, in some countries that I visited, children are like all children. They run around and play, and they cut their feet on pieces of sharp wood or metal or glass. And then I've known of cases where they also continue to play even though they're cut and step into contaminated water where there's parasites and so on that work their way up through the bloodstream and eventually get to the heart and kill the child just because they didn't have a $20 pair of shoes. In some cases, children, I've known of a family where they had 3 kids and 1 pair of shoes, and so to go to school, you have to have a pair of shoes. So what they would do is take turns every other day wearing, they would kind of take turns wearing the shoes so they could go to school every other day. They just don't have a pair of shoes. And so in the global village, it's very easy for us to either go or to send resources so that children can have a better life and know that Jesus cares about them.
Let's talk about that for just a minute, too, because I know that, as I mentioned a minute ago, if anybody knows Buckner outside of the state of Texas, it's probably because of the Shoes for Orphans.
Right.
And there have been a lot of radio stations, including maybe some that are actually a part of this broadcast right now, that have done that. So how did they connect up with you if a local church wanted to do it, or if a radio station wanted to do it, maybe tied into a share-a-thon or some other event? How can they do so?
It's very easy. You can go to buckner.org, and on our website, there's a link for Shoes for Orphan Souls, or to go right to the site. We have a separate site called shoesfororphansouls.com, and shoesfororphansouls.com, they can click on that, and we have all the collateral, all the instructions that, if you sign up, we'll send you the packet so that you can do a shoe drive. It could be in your Sunday school class, in your church or civic club. Even I've had businesses do a shoe drive, and get their customers involved. And we know of churches that have had a shoeless Sunday where they bring their shoes on that day and don't wear shoes to church, and to know what it's like. And those shoes are then sent to Dallas. We have a Center for Humanitarian Aid. We sort the shoes between boys and girls and then sizes. And then we send them to our places outside the U.S. and beyond that, because we don't use all the shoes. We do send them to over 80 countries now. In the last 15 years, it's been 3 million pairs of shoes. So it's really a fantastic way to, who can't afford $20 here in the U.S. to make a difference in a child's life? So that's what we encourage people to do.
So again, let's give some of those websites. One was buckner.org.
Sure, buckner.org. Right.
And that would be good for anybody that's trying to connect up with you in terms of some of these activities.
Right.
And then the Shoes for Orphans, right?
Right. Shoes for Orphan Souls, spell it all out, no caps, shoesfororphansouls.com.
Okay.
And that's that'll help you just go on the website and click, put the information that you about yourself, and then we'll send you the packet saying this is how you do a shoe drive. Everything from how do you get the word out to how do you box them up and send them to us. So that's that's how that works.
One of the things people always want to know is, can they put something in with the shoes like tracks or things like that, or how do you kind of minister to the spiritual needs as well?
Right. We have volunteers that come to our Humanitarian Aid Center for Humanitarian Aid, and they separate the shoes between boys and girls and then the sizes. And with each pair of shoes, a volunteer normally writes a message. And I know because I've been on the other end unpacking the shoes and giving them to a child. And usually there's a message that says, Jesus loves you, or a Bible verse, or some word of endearment that shows the love of Christ in a practical way. So that's how we do that.
Well, again, we certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. For many people, this may be the first time they've heard about Buckner International, but I hope they'll connect up with you. And I'm hoping this might be the first time they've heard about the Jesus Agenda, because it's a book about 180 pages just out. And I appreciate you taking the time to come in studio with us today and educate us. One last time, if you have anybody that needs this or would like to get this, they could get multiple copies, couldn't they, or discounts or things of that nature?
Sure. If it's a Bible study group or a church that wants to get a number of copies, we can probably make an arrangement to send them directly, or they can go straight to Amazon.com and purchase it there.
Again, I appreciate you coming in and joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby. Been great.
The book, again, is entitled The Jesus Agenda, Becoming an Agent of Redemption. Becoming an Agent of Redemption. Dr. Albert Reyes is with us, and if you would like to know a little bit more, first of all, you can go to the website pointofview.net. First hour today, we talked with Dr. Thomas Kidd, and of course spent some time learning a little bit more about George Whitefield. And in the second hour here, talking about the Jesus Agenda, and wanted to kind of just disconnect a little bit from some of the issues in the news, but we'll get back to those tomorrow, as you well know. But during the summer months, it's a time to look at a couple of other issues and to kind of step back, and especially in this issue, to recognize that we don't have to make a choice between evangelism and social service. The two go together. After all, so many times in missions, we recognize we had to feed hungry stomachs so we could feed hungry souls. And so there are certainly a need to bring both of those together in terms of the gospel, and I think you will really enjoy this book, The Jesus Agenda. One last time, just before we walk out the door, let's mention that we do give you an opportunity to express to your 2 United States senators and your representative your thoughts about Planned Parenthood. We suggest that it is maybe time to defund Planned Parenthood. Why send $528 million to Planned Parenthood in light of all the things we've learned from some of those videos? So if you'd like to take that action item, we have posted it on the website. If you'd like to listen to this broadcast again, the podcast is available, and we hope that you'll take the time to be the hands and feet of Jesus as you go into the world. I want to thank Andrew and Matthew and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Hank Aaron and Tony Gwynn. Even if you're not a big baseball fan, there's a chance that you've heard each of those names. Hammer and Hank hit 755 home runs. Gwynn, a contact hitter, better known for singles and doubles than the big bomb. But both men are in the Hall of Fame, and any team would have been glad to have them. Point of View needs a team of partners, including both Aarons and Gwynns. Are you a home run giver, or can you contribute a single? If you and every listener this week gave just $5 today, we could pay our program costs for about the next 3 years. 3 years, just $5. Step up to the plate today. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Do your part, $5. Support the winning team at Point of View. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.